Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today, and welcome to this CM Crossroads webcast series broadcast, Death to Manual Deployments, Achieving Consistent Deployments Across Environments. This webcast is brought to you by CM Crossroads and is sponsored by Urban Code, the makers of Anthill Pro. I'm Patrick Egan, publisher of CM Crossroads, and I'll be your moderator again today for this webcast. Well, in a few moments, Jeffrey Frederick and Eric Minnick will join us to examine best practices, helpful tools, and common pitfalls encountered when seeking consistent deployments across environments. But first, let me take care of a few housekeeping details. This broadcast is intended to be interactive, so you can post your questions at any time during the broadcast by using the chat box that you can see over on the right side of the screen. You can also chat with other attendees during the session about this presentation. We'll also address some of your questions during a Q&A session at the end of the program. And if we're unable to get to any of your questions during the program, just don't worry, we'll follow up by email after the program. I also want to mention that if you'd like to pop out the chat box, you can see a little pop-out button down there in the bottom right corner of the chat window, and that will make it movable so that you can undock it and it won't get hidden behind the slides. Also, if you'd like to follow along with your friends at home, you can use the Twitter and Facebook like buttons at the top of the slide image. Don't forget to use the hashtag CMCLC so that your chats will appear in the tweet roll over on the right side of the screen as well. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, click on the links button, not resources, but links, over on the right side of the screen, and you'll see a link down there for the presentation slides as well. Also, if at any time during the presentation, if you'd like to get a closer look at any slide, just mouse over the presentation viewer and click on the full button, and that'll expand it to the full size of the screen. Well, let me introduce our speakers today. Jeff Frederick is an internationally recognized expert on continuous integration. He's a 19-year veteran of the software industry and has performed and managed virtually every role in the software development lifecycle. Also joining us will be Eric Minnick. He's a lead consultant at Urban Code, where he helps customers get the most out of their build and release processes with Anthill Pro. Eric has been at the forefront of continuous integration for over 6 years and has worked on all 3 generations of Urban Code's Anthill products. Well, if you guys are ready to go, I'll turn it over to you. Jeff and Eric, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Patrick. And yeah, thanks for everyone joining us today. This is a topic that Eric and I care about quite a lot. And as you might tell from the title, it's mostly because we really hate manual deployments. The reasons are pretty self-explanatory, but Eric, you want to walk us through all those reasons that we hate manual deployments?
Absolutely. You know, we hate them because they're slow, they're inconsistent. The inconsistency tends to lead to failing in production, and you don't really know who deployed what, where, or when you failed that deployment to production. Other than that, I guess they're okay. But
yeah, I mean, so they're fine as long as you don't care about your deployments being successful the first time, about wasting time, about extra failures, and about an audit trail. But if those don't matter to you, then that's fine. Now, one thing before we really get into sort of the bulk of our webinar, I want to say that I know when we put out there and we say that people hate manual deployments, that we hate manual deployments, and that everyone, we think people should hate them also. We often get pushback. There are people who actually really like manual deployments, right? Who find that there are things that they like about them. Very often we hear that people say they like the control. They feel like if it's automated, then they're not in control. Now, we don't agree, but we understand some people feel this way. There's also some other things that people say about manual deployments. I mean, Eric, you encounter these. What are the reasons that you hear people saying that they like their current process?
There's a lot of organizational inertia. We've always done it manually. There might not be perfect, but the devil I know is better than the devil I don't. And then I think just that, again, that feeling of I control it. I run the command at the command line. I can see all the output. If something doesn't look right or if something goes wrong, I know what I can do to go fix it. And so I feel okay because I'm the one at the command line. You'll notice I use the word I a lot around that. And I think what we find is the person who's actually executing the manual deployment, if they're not pulling their hair out, if they're not too frustrated by working a lot of evenings and weekends, they might feel okay, but everybody else doesn't feel as good about the process as the person at the keyboard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The person who is in their comfort zone is familiar with what's happening. A lot of times they don't feel the pain. Now things can change. Maybe they get suddenly a huge workload comes on them and they have a lot more deployments to do, and suddenly now it becomes a problem. But if as long as the workload's what they've always experienced, then yeah, there's problems. It's not perfect, but then nothing's perfect. But they don't feel the pain themselves. Now, the other objection we're going to get from people I know is they're going to say, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me. Sure, manual deployments are stupid, but that's not what we have. What we have are scripts, right? Scripts are completely different, and so, yeah, we're fine, because that's not us. But actually, if you just have a whole series of scripts, we think that you actually are doing a manual deployment. Parts may be automated, but essentially what you have is a manual automated process. So there's a lot of knowledge that still applies if you have a bunch of piecemeal scripts you're putting together. I mean, how many scripts do you have? What order do they need to run? Does everyone have the right permission to run them? Are they same across environments, right? So if you're servicing multiple environments, such as your test environment, your performance test environment, your UAT environment, staging and production, are you maintaining 5 different sets of scripts, or do you have some script sharing going on? And even if you have all these things scripted, what are the pieces you're still doing manually? Are you copying files to a certain location manually? Are there settings that you're doing manually? Are there tweaks that you need to do to get things to actually work? All these things that aren't scripted out, are essentially the part why you still have a manual deployment. And again, scripts are good, but they're really only part of what we consider a fully automated deployment. So we wanted to handle those 2 objections early and say you may wonder if these things apply to you, but here's I think why they would still apply, even if you have scripts and even if you feel comfortable with your manual deployments. Now, to the extent that we love or hate manual deployments, we love automated deployments. Really because they're everything that manual deployments are not. They're not slow. They are consistent. If you are doing consistent deployment across environments, then you don't fail when you go to production. And of course, you actually do know who deployed what, where, and when. Your audit trail is intact. You're ready to win at Clue. You have all that information. So those are the really beginnings of why we love automated deployments. But there's more than that. I think once you have automated deployments in place, delivering consistency across environments, then what you find is actually there's additional benefits to automated deployments. Eric, do you want to walk us through those?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got a basic platform of automation, right? And it's distributed across your network. It's in a bunch of environments, and that allows you to go and do a bunch of more interesting things. Continuous or regular deployments automatically update the test environment every night or even with every build. Roll smoke testing into the process. So you deploy it, you smoke test it. If that fails, you roll back. These sorts of things allow you to take this kind of automation infrastructure, the automation platform, and really say, okay, now that I've got some time back because I'm not doing manual deployments, how do I make our process better? How do we deliver higher quality products to our customers? And the other part of this I really like, and we're going to talk a lot about that, is empowering people while increasing control. So being able to divorce security rights from who's able to log in a little bit, open up self-service, not have to wait on deployment people not being harassed all the time. And really what we get to is a situation where our automation infrastructure allows us to do our deployments better, faster, and cheaper. Look at those 3, pick any 3. I don't know, which of those 3 would you take, Jeff?
Well, I think I would probably go for better and then cheaper and then faster. But your mileage may vary. So the point is that we really think there's a lot of benefit in automation, and then hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're here because you agree, and now you want to find out, how to actually get the most out of an automated solution. So in our program today, we're going to kind of walk through what we see happening with today's manual deployments. So this is the status quo. And as we walk through here, I think this is an opportunity for you to look at and say which of these elements we talked about apply in your environment. Second, we'll then introduce what the elements of the fully automated solution would be. So if you're going to put an automated solution in place, you can look and say, do we have these different elements taken care of? And finally, we're going to say, once you have that automated solution in place, we're going to expand on the idea that Eric talked about of having a platform for improvement, and kind of talk about how you then grow that out, the different best practices that are available for taking advantage of it. So first, we're going to start with, what we see with today's manual deployments. And the idea here is that these are the things that you can take back to people to say, this is why we should look to change our process. So let's go into full, you might be a redneck mode, inspired by Jeff Foxworthy. Eric, why don't you tell us some signs that you might have a manual deployment?
All right, and we're going to go through all of these in a lot more depth. But if the handoffs, either the you should go do this or the here's the stuff to deploy are done through email, might have a manual deployment. If everybody's deploying differently, you probably have a manual deployment. I know your favorite, and we'll get in this one, tweaks communicated on an as-broken basis as opposed to an as-changing basis, have a manual deployment. If your deployment document has all your steps and it's a really big SharePoint document, have a manual deployment. And then if your developers have production passwords, probably have a manual deployment. But we can get into each of them.
Yep, and I think we'll start off with, handoffs are through email, or file shares. Now, remember what we have up here then are all those reasons we said we hated about manual deployments. And what we're going to do for each of these, we're going to show how those actually, these manual steps actually impact that. And this is a great example. Starting off with the handoffs through email is our first candidate, because actually it hits all four bases here. It's a home run of badness when it comes to manual deployments. Handoffs through email are slow. You have problems with consistency. It's very easy to end up with different files in different environments. And because of that, then you end up with that problem of failing in production. And at the end, you really don't have a good track record of who deployed what, where, and when. I like what you said, Eric, in one of our discussions, which is, well, if our email's backed up, does that mean we have an audit trail? Answer, no, right? So the point here is that the handoffs through email or through file shares in the network, sort of magic places to put binaries, really is a root cause of the problems that you see in manual deployments. The second example, sign that you might have a manual deployment and it leads to problems, are that developers, QA, and ops are deploying differently. Eric, do you want to explain where this comes into problems?
Yeah, no, this is a very common scenario where developers are optimizing their deployments so that they can get to the dev test environment as quickly as possible, as little work as possible. Operations is demanding a very detailed deployment document on here's how you deploy, and they're doing things much more manually. And then QA is stuck in the middle, maybe using the automation from one side or the steps from the other side, often doing some sort of a hybrid or their own approach. And what you end up with is everybody deploys differently. And so you have this implicit inconsistency in the deployment process. Things fail because of that. And because the first time you're using the production style deployment, the first time you use the production deployment process is in production, it's prone to failure. It hasn't been tested. And I think the really related thing to this is that next element, that tweaks are communicated on an as-broken basis rather than on the as-changing basis. And Jeffrey, I know you love this one, so I'll let you take over again.
Well, I do, and this, you're right. This really is the evil twin that goes along with the fact that you're deploying differently to different environments. And what happens, it's understandable that the different groups kind of are working on different cadences. You have the developers who are maybe doing daily deployments or multiple times a day because they want to see the stuff that I'm working on now. I just made this change. Let me see it right now, see how it works. And so they have a deployment process that's optimized for that. QA people are going to be probably deploying less frequently because they have test cycles that are running during the day, but maybe they take a new build, twice a week is about the average we usually find. So they're kind of in between the rhythm, because on the other hand, operations is going to do, hopefully they do one release per cycle. That's their goal, is to just release once and have it work and have everything be fine. And that difference in cadence leads to them using different solutions. But the problem here is that then as changes occur that need to change the deployment process, they tend to not be communicated. developers, initially, require some new property, they make the change to their environment, and it's only when the build stops working in QA they tell them, oh, that's right, I forgot you need to go and change this setting. So QA makes their change, they change their process maybe to account for it, they hand it over to ops, and of course what happens there, you're missing that property, things fail, it's like, oh, that's right, I forgot you need to do this. And of course it's on a real release cycle, it's likely to be not just a single property or single setting that's changing, it's probably a whole family of properties. And and again you have that fact that these changes that were known about weren't communicated consistently, they weren't captured by the deployment process, really is what leads to things breaking. And of course, always at the worst possible time, that point that you're ready to go live. So I think this is really is the evil twin of that a fact that you're using different deployment technologies, different deployment process in the different environments. So that's my favorite one that is a sign of a problem with deployments. But the other one that we see, this is a pretty good indicator of a manual process, is that deployment steps are written in a huge document. Now I know that when people said, oh, they look at the last one and go, oh yeah, that's no good, you're communicating as broken, those should be in the document. You really should have those documented, and then there wouldn't be a problem. But actually we find that's not the case. Eric, talk about some of the problems we see with these huge deployment documents. And what do we mean by huge anyway? Why don't you talk about some of the sizes that you've seen?
I've seen several deployment process documents for here's how we deploy our application or system that are Excel spreadsheets on multiple pages in Excel, with each page being a couple hundred lines, total of thousands of steps. And sometimes it's better, sometimes it's just a one-page Word document. Sometimes it's just up on SharePoint. That's okay. I think we always say if SharePoint's involved in your deployment process and you aren't deploying changes to SharePoint, probably a bad sign. But yeah, and I think that the challenge here is, when we're trying to execute dozens, hundreds, thousands of steps, right, we need to make sure that those are all documented absolutely correctly, that we know that what one person typed is what someone else interprets when they read it, and that when they know what they're supposed to do, they still type in everything exactly correctly. And I don't think I am capable of doing 1,000 things in a row correctly, and I don't think most people are, which leads to a lot of just fumbles and failures. And we somewhere in this need to deal with environment-specific differences, right? What are the different URLs or passwords that happen in the production environment versus an earlier test environment, and how does that work into the document? And then we have to remember to update it. So there's just a lot of opportunities to fail with these large documents. No reason why we have to fail, but a lot of opportunities to fail, and so we tend to fail.
And when we fail, the inevitable result that we tend to find is that developers have production passwords. Now, I know, Eric, in your experience, if we ask management, do your developers have production passwords, what's the answer we get?
Absolutely not. Never. That would be horrible. We'd fail audit. And it's probably what 95% of people on this call are thinking as well. They're looking at this going, yeah, we don't have developers with production passwords. That would be crazy. And half of the people are wrong. Some developer has a production password, and they have it because a deployment failed. And then at 3 in the morning, when there was desperation to just get the system live again so we don't have the expense of things being out, said, Jim, developer, you know this system best. Go get in there, fix it. Gave him production password. Hour later, when everything was fixed, everyone was so relieved and so desperate to go home. They went home. They forgot Jim got a production password. And Jim can actually get into production whenever he wants. He usually doesn't. But sometimes, when he needs a log or something, he'll go in there and grab it.
Yeah, and maybe there's a quick, a tweak that needs to happen. He'll just, fix up the deployment, to make everything better. It's done with the best of intentions in the worst of circumstances, but the reality is it happens, and that, as we say, very often people don't even realize this is a situation that they have. Now, I'm guessing, I don't know, I think our title, Death to Manual Deployments, probably scared away a lot of the really hardcore believers in manual deployments. But the people here who would like to make a change to their manual deployment process need to go back and do battle with those people. And I think one argument you're likely to encounter is to say, we wouldn't have these problems, that this is not a problem with our process, right? The problem is with our people. Right? And now if only we can have our people be more disciplined, well, then we wouldn't have these problems. We could make deployment documents that would be complete, right? Maybe 2,000 lines aren't enough. Maybe we need to have it be 3,000 lines, but whatever it takes, right? We just need to document it better. And we would then need to make sure we update them. So, just it's the people being disciplined. And then, we could follow those steps. We could do that. And we could have audit spreadsheets. We could make sure we capture everything. If we would have all these problems solved, if it's just a question of people doing the right thing. The problem with this hope, with this belief, is that you're really asking people to be machines, to do everything perfectly the same way every single time. And if there's anything we know about people, it's that people don't make good machines. Eric, when you want to talk about this lessons from Alistair Coburn here?
Yeah, and I know this is one of your favorite papers, and having finally read it, I love it as well. Beautiful title of characterizing people as nonlinear first-order components in software development, which you look at, you cringe a little bit. But basically, what that says is, hey, people are a very key variable in software development, and we should understand what they're good at and not good at, and how they communicate. And really, what people are good at is using creative judgment to help the project along, to help get something accomplished, to fix a problem. What they're not good at is acting consistently, acting in a repeatable fashion. And that's really what machines are good at. And so what we would encourage is to try to automate, leverage the strengths of both, so that the boring, rote, repeated stuff, following 1,000 steps exactly correctly over and over again, delegate that to the machine. Let the people create those steps. Let the people design processes that are efficient and work, and let them react and fix things when things go wrong.
No, I think that's just it. I think at this point we kind of laid out our case against manual deployments, and the elements of manual deployments we think that actually are the root cause of why manual deployments end up failing. It's worth saying though, if manual deployments are so bad, how come more people don't have this sort of shared automated deployment infrastructure in place? And I think it's worth understanding that shared deployment automation is really an unnatural act. That there's this concept called Conway's Law that says organizations are constrained to produce solutions that copy the structure of their organization. Now, this is usually applied to in architecture. You say if you have 3 development teams combining on a system, you're going to end up with a 3-tiered architecture or 3 major components, right? The structure of the organization dictates the solution they come up with. And so when you have these 3 functional silos of development, QA, and operations, it's natural that they each solve their own problem because they don't have a real strong incentive for something end-to-end. They each care about their own problem. Right? Operations, their main concern is maintaining control. Right? It doesn't care about the development environment. It is not concerned about what happens there. And they don't need to worry about the rapid changes that happen in development. So whatever solution they come up with is likely to not be able to keep up with the frequent changes that happen in development. On the other hand, development really very often doesn't want the responsibility for production deployments. Right? They say, look, let the ops people figure it out. They're the ones who need to maintain it. When something goes wrong at 2 in the morning, I don't want you calling me, right? Get the ops people to fix it. Our job is to create the software. Now, it would seem natural that QA, because they're sort of in between very often in the flow of software from development operations, that they would be the place that would have the most vested interest in a shared infrastructure, because they need to have somewhat close to the same frequency as development, and they have the same interest in control and correctness that you have in operations. But the reality is that that generally QA lacks influence to change what's happening in either development or production. So they may come up with some automation in their environment, but it's not likely to be picked up by either of the other groups. So we think that's kind of like the final barrier that people have to putting this kind of solution in place. But we're optimistic. We're assuming that you guys on this call are all now going to be interested in putting a shared solution in place. And hopefully we've given you some arguments to use against your current process. And you're ready to learn, well, great. So what would be the elements of an automated solution? What do we need to really have an end-to-end a solution in place that we can use across environments? And what Eric and I see is that there's sort of 5 key elements in a complete solution, right? The scripts, environment definitions, an artifact repository, access control, and audit trail. And we're going to go ahead and go through each one of these. So first off, we're going back to scripts. These are the things that we said earlier, that scripts are only part of the solution, but they are actually part of the solution, right? Scripts allow you to be fast and consistent and repeatable. But, Eric, very often what we find is that they don't actually exist, or that there's certain problems with them. So why don't you talk a little bit about what we need from scripts versus what we actually find when we go in and talk to people?
Sure. And I think, we had a question come in from the audience asking what exactly we meant by an automated deployment, and that's the area we're in now. So when I look at we need an automated script or automated scripts, the little point solution scripts that we may or may not have, that could be part of the solution. But really, I like to go back to that huge Excel spreadsheet, the 1,000 lines of steps. What we basically need is we need that Excel spreadsheet to have a button at the top that says Go. And you can click on that. And all 1,000 steps run exactly correctly in the right order. They just run. So what we need is not a bunch of these independent, small point solution scripts that need to be maintained in different places. We need a single script or a single process, and we need to be able to reuse that across a number of environments. And we'll talk about the environment definition later that's helpful with that. And then we need that button that's at the top of our Excel spreadsheet that says Go. We need that to be access controlled. We need to make it so that only the right people can use that when they're targeting production, that our developers can use that when they're targeting the dev test environments, that our testers can use that when they're working with their various functional testing and performance test environments. So those are the big things that we need out of automated scripts. We need to move from a bunch of point scripts to one massive process that's reusable.
Yeah, and now one of the things you point out there is reusing across environments. And really what makes that work is the idea of environment definitions and storing information for reuse. So why don't you talk about how that works in practice?
Yeah, so this is a really common challenge, right? We know that we're going to deploy to somewhere other than production, right? Several test environments usually. I think we ran our survey, and a typical organization for a typical project is running anywhere from 4 to 7 test environments in between. And I've certainly seen dozens of environments for a single project. And we know there's some variances. There's topologies, which servers are involved, those sorts of things, but also things like what's the database password our web application should use to connect to the database? What's the connection string to get into the database? Those sorts of things that often require editing property files, INI files, app config files, XML documents that configure the application. So how do those get rolled in? Sometimes we've seen on a per server basis there's some file that gets fed into an install script that does that editing. Sometimes this is all done manually. We've seen rebuild per environment. There's a lot of kind of awkward solutions out in the market right now for this. What we really want to do is have a formal definition of an environment and really say, okay, in this environment, the database password is secret. In the production environment, the database password is some crazy string the length of my arm. And then have our script, our process definition that runs in every environment, inject it with the environment-specific configuration so it can go ahead and update the property files every time correctly, make sure they're totally up to date. That's really what we're shooting for. And while we're controlling these passwords, we're going to have to handle them securely and filter them out of logs and not leak secrets.
And I think
that's really what we're shooting for. Go for it.
One thing that you're talking there with the secrecy of passwords and things like that is the point that some of these properties are going to be sensitive. So when you have your environment definition, you want to make sure that you have an ability for the people who own the secret, like the database admin who knows the production password, is the only one. He can go in and set the property. Other people can use it, but can't necessarily see it. That's an important consideration in a lot of environments. All right, so we have our scripts now. We have our environment definition. Fantastic. So that means we kind of set out now the proper way to do our steps across each environment. The next major element of a solution would be an artifact repository. You know, in the artifact repository, the job there is to know what you're getting, to know that you're getting the same artifacts in each environment. You know, we have up here kind of some results from a survey we ran asking people, you know, where do you get your artifacts that you're going to deploy? And the reality is that it's very often that people don't have a consistent repository that they can use across, you know, to pull their binaries for each environment. So Eric, again, why don't you talk us through a little bit what we need in our artifact repository?
Right. So we want to be a little bit more sophisticated than that Dropbox file system approach where, you know, development drops the latest binary out into some folder and emails operations and says, deploy whatever's in the magic box. And Op says, okay, I guess development likes that, so I'll go grab that. What we really want in ITIL terms, for those of you who are familiar with that, is a definitive software library, definitive media library. Fundamentally, we want an authoritative place where we go get the stuff we're going to deploy, and we know what version it is, and we know that if I deploy this thing to the QA environment, I can then deploy the same thing to the production environment, and no one's going to tamper with it in between. No one's going to replace what's in my Dropbox. I have it actually versioned. You know, I think the next best thing to that would be to actually use like a source control system. That's a little bit better. But we want this definitive software library. So we have the same stuff in every environment. It's tamper-proof. And then we're going to want some sort of policies for throwing away old versions of things we're deploying, particularly as our deployment paces ramp up and we get drops more frequently. We want some sort of mechanism for throwing out old builds that we're deploying. Is there anything you want to add to that, Jeff?
No, I think that's good. And if you kind of look at what we're building up here, we now have the scripts for consistency. We have the environment definitions so we can reuse them. We have the artifact repository so that we're getting the right stuff. And then what we need next is access control. And you alluded to this earlier, Eric, which is that access control is about, you know, sort of that separations of duties kind of consideration, right? You want to be able to have control over who can push the button to do the deployment. That's going to vary by environment. And so, you know, the most common thing we see is that people will say, you know, we're going to want, as you said, developers to control what goes in the development environment, but a QA is going to control what goes into the test environment. And, you know, because they're going to want to be able to do deployments when it's not going to interfere with their test cycle. And naturally, you're going to have your operations people out there running the production deployment. So we're running the same scripts. You know, we're pulling in different environment variables set by the right environment owners, and now we're having the execution happen by the right people. Right. So this is really fundamental to having that sort of separations of duties. And you can see here, if we relate back to what people like about manual deployments, right? Very often they say is that feeling of control, and very often control means we have the right person doing it. Right, you know, we're controlling by permission who can log in to the machine and run the steps. But really, if you have access control over who can, you know, launch your automation, you're achieving the same end result of, you know, access control of who can do the action, while increasing the control over the consistency of the steps. And with the artifact repository, you're increasing your control over the content of what you're doing. So you really actually end up with very good control over the steps, the content, the settings, and also, you know, who is doing it. So all the control that you need is there. And so the last major piece is, for most enterprises, is going to be, great, we have that consistency, but we still need to pass audit. We need to know what happened. And, you know, Eric, we really are strong believers that this kind of automation gives you a better audit trail than you'll ever have from a manual deployment. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. What we see very commonly is an attempt to add audit on at the end of a process when it's all manual. There's very little tracing back to see, did this deployment that we're about to do in production, did the deployment work in dev test or early test environments? You might have that sort of audit trail for the staging environment. So we see an audit trail that often starts in production and is often based on a spreadsheet where people are taking screenshots, loading them into a system or a spreadsheet to say, look, I did it this way, I ran these commands. Sometimes we see a little bit of added sophistication where every command line command run in production goes into a special log. But even that's just kind of auditing either based on what we think happened or only in production. What we really want is that end-to-end, right? We want to know who deployed what, where, and when, everywhere. Did our test stop failing? Or did our test start failing? Did we deploy yesterday, right? Do we have visibility into that? And obviously production counts most. What we don't want is for people to be responsible for putting into a spreadsheet what they think they did or have to remember that they did something. When we're doing push-button automation or scheduled automation, it is really easy for the automated tool to record what it did. And it will do that every time correctly with no added work, no added burden on the person who pressed the button. It just needs to record that that person pressed the button. So that's what I like. Much better traceability for less work. That seems like a good combination.
Yeah, it's a great combination. And I think you really captured the essence of you actually have a record. You can substantiate what you actually did, not a guess as what you think you did. Now, if you put all these things together, what do we get from this automated system? Is we end up with the number one goal, which is we have confidence that our production deployments will succeed. Right? I think one of the people I was talking to who was looking to put this kind of system in place and said, what we're looking for is reliable confidence, right? That every time it's going to work. And so that's, I think, the overriding number one goal. All these pieces go together so that your production deployments are successful. You also end up with additional benefits as well.
Exactly. So not just do you know that the deployments are going to succeed in production and be reasonably fast, you start seeing these other benefits like QA is actually testing more recent builds because it's less of a hassle and less risk to take a new drop. It just happens and they have less incidents of I can't test because the deployment failed, right? The developers, they just get their deployments automatically, every hour, something like that. I think you've seen scenarios where developers say, oh yeah, no, our deployments are really easy. It takes no time at all to do. And they just say, see, I do this, and that's easy, and then I do this, and then I do this, and I do this, and 15 minutes later they do a deployment. And that's fine, but what we really want is for that just to happen. And if it just happens automatically, they'll always be looking at the latest stuff. They won't have to make that decision of, do I get coffee, or do I do more development, or do I see what my latest development has achieved by taking 15 minutes to do a deployment? You get that audit trail, and you get that separation of duties that you want. So you get a lot of nice little benefits. All right. Go ahead and keep pushing. Now, Jeff, you dropped off there for a second. Are you back?
Yeah, sorry. I'm back now. I mean, hopefully people look at all those benefits and it sounds compelling, and hopefully you can take it back to the people it'll be compelling. But we're going to do that one step forward, one step more. You've got this in place, but we're going to say that's really just the beginning. As we said, these automated deployments can be the platform for a whole series of improvements. And so we're going to kind of lay out some best practices that you can put in place after you have an automated system for deployment. Those practices are going to be, let's see, I guess on the right slide here. Deferred deployments, self-service deployments, automatic deployment, automatic smoke tests, automated rollback, and continuous production deployment. So, and these actually, we're going to lay these out as a sort of a chain that you're building, where each every bit we do along here is going to build on the previous step. So we're going to start with deferred deployment, and this is pretty straightforward. This is the idea that operations people often have. They want the deployment to happen at midnight, but they don't want to be there at midnight. So the ability to actually say, I'm going to push the button to have this automation happen, but I actually want the automation to happen later. And then if there's a problem, text me, email me, something like that. I think that's a really valuable practice that certainly your operations people, anyone who's there usually at midnight for those deployments is going to appreciate this. Next one we go to is a self-service deployment. Eric, you want to lay out the story of self-service deployments?
Absolutely, and we've been talking about self-service deployments throughout, but we want to kind of formally address it here. And really what we're shooting for is just to allow each team, the business owner of an environment, to decide when a new drop comes in and not have to wait on somebody else to give them the drop. They just say, yeah, I'll take that latest build and we'll put it in the functional test environment. QA wants to be able to do that. And so that's a really nice thing. One of the places where we've seen this most dramatically is where organizations have offshore testing departments. They might have a nightly deployment process that's fine most of the time, but if the version that they got was so broken that it was untestable, the offshore team would have to ask someone, back at headquarters, could you give us a different drop? And headquarters was home. They were, asleep. They were with their families. And so they'd lose a whole day of testing. And once you introduce self-service deployments, the QA team can go, okay, that version was terrible. Let's go look at the earlier version, one from a few hours earlier in the day. Let's deploy that one instead. Okay, good. This one is testable. Might not have the latest changes, but we can at least run through some test cases, find some bugs, and have a productive day. So self-service deployments can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think that this is really the core. One of the things we talked earlier about, empowering people. This is where we're talking about where you no longer have people waiting for that someone else to do deployment for them. And similarly, the deployment people aren't being harassed by people who are waiting for their deployments. And I know you and I very often have been in meetings where we're talking to someone whose job it is to do the deployments, and their pager's going off, and they're like, oh yeah, I got to do this as soon as I'm out of this meeting. And there's two things that are happening there. One is, the people that are waiting while this guy's finishing up his meeting or his lunch or whatever is going on. And second, he's already feeling anxiety over all the things he needs to do when he gets back to his desk. It's not a good situation for either of them. Self-service deployment really helps break that cycle. It allows the people to get on with their life, and allows him, as you said, to invest more, the automation person to invest more in having a robust system. So it's really a win-win to put these self-service things in place. Now, the next level beyond self-service is sometimes you just want things to happen automatically, right? This is the example we talked about, how very often the developers want to be seeing their latest changes as quickly as possible so they can validate the work they did work correctly. One good solution, and we think this is something people should look to do, is that after a successful build, automatically deploy to a development server. Have a development test environment that is always reflecting the latest of what you have in source control. And I think this is a huge win for developers to be able to rapidly test what they've done and really take ownership, more ownership over the quality of what they've done. So that just they can get so much better feedback rapidly on the changes they made, and they'll put it to good use. So we think this sort of automatic deployment, at least to the development environment, makes a lot of sense. Some people go further and will then say, well, every night we're going to automatically deploy to our QA environment as well. We think that's another good building block to do with this sort of automatic deployment. The next level with this is the automatic smoke test. Eric, you want to explain this one?
Yeah, very simple idea. After I run my deployment, automatically kick off some automated tests to make sure that the application fundamentally works. So this is really common in test environments, that you'll deploy it and immediately run a suite of tests. But it's also interesting when you start looking at both earlier and later environments, even production, to say, hey, immediately after I deploy to production, run this battery of quick tests that let me know people can still log in, they can get to their shopping cart, they can do this and that and the other. Okay, good, the app works. Or, no, the app is fundamentally broken. We should either look at fixing that immediately or, which is our next slide, initiate a rollback.
Yeah, and I think the rollback is really something that fits very well with the approach of the automated smoke tests. And I can say from my time in QA, it's great to come in and have the new build there. It's less great if that latest build was actually broken. And even if you have the smoke test telling you, hey, it was broken, it's even better to have the information, an email in your inbox saying, we tried deploying the latest build to your test environment, but it failed the smoke test. So we reverted to yesterday's build. You have the last good build currently available to test. That's fantastic, right? It gives me confidence that when I come in, I'll be able to be productive. And this is something that actually works across the entire chain. This is good for development. It's also good all the way out to production, that if we've done an automated deployment and it's failed, having the ability to automatically roll back is going to be a huge time saver and really give us confidence that we're going to have a working environment as often as possible, as much as possible. Now, if we put all these pieces into place, then we end up with kind of the ultimate goal for a lot of people these days, which is continuous deployment. Eric, you want to tell us the continuous production deployment story?
Sure thing. This is the extreme, would be the first thing I would say. And I do like looking at this as, for a lot of organizations where it's not realistic, to look at it as, can I get all the pieces in place that I need so that I could do this if it was appropriate for my company? And we'll look at why. So, basic idea. Developer makes a change. They commit it to source control. Within a couple hours, even shorter, that's in production. And no person was involved in between. So what does that take? That takes a lot of things. It takes an automated build. It takes automatically deploying those pieces out to one or more test environments, running a huge number of tests, so that if they all pass, we can automatically deploy to production. We can then test that deployment in production, monitor its quality in production, and if there are problems, roll back to what we had before. Now, in a lot of, if I'm a bank, I don't care about I don't know how much I trust my tests that someone isn't going to be able to introduce a change that's going to steal all my money. So I'm probably not going to go this way. But all the pieces are really good. We've got the automated deployment. We have enough tests that we get really great feedback. We have production quality monitoring put in. A lot of these things that are really, really helpful. So I like looking at continuous production deployments and working with people to say, all right, if you were to do this, what would you need? What pieces do you have? What pieces do you not have? And almost universally, the pieces that they need are things that they agree that they would benefit from. And it can be a really nice benchmarking tool and a way of framing the how do we improve. Which of those things do we want to do first? Anything you wanted to add to that, Jeffrey?
I'll just say for people who are interested in, who believe this is, not realistic for any environment, I would say, go Google the term continuous deployment, and you'll find a lot of conversations about, companies that actually do this, that actually put their crown jewels, the software that they run the business on, in production automatically. The seminal blog on this was Timothy Fitz, talking about his experience at IMVU, that's IMVU, and his blog entry was called Doing the Impossible 50 Times a Day, which is to say they had 50 rollouts of production every day automatically. And he really described in detail the kind of environment they had in place to support this. So this is kind of as you said, the pinnacle in our maturity model, our enterprise CM maturity model. This is marked as insane in the sense that, for a lot of people, you probably don't need to go this far. But like I said, it's a really good thing to look at as a point of comparison. So with that, in summary, we think that at root, manual deployments are fundamentally flawed as a concept. We think that they end up being slow and broken because they require people to act like machines to be successful, and that people are not good machines. On the other hand, we think that computers are fantastic machines. So go and put some computers in place to do the mechanical process to give you the consistency and reliability. And finally, that automated deployments are worth doing the investment to get in place, because not only from their own benefits, but because they really provide a solid foundation for further improvement. So with that in mind, I do want to say, I know that every time we do a webinar and we talk about these kind of topics, people ask us questions about our products. At Urban Code, we have two products. We have Antil Pro for development automation. We have Urban Deploy, which is a deployment automation tool that helps you achieve everything we just talked about. However, we're not really here to talk about the product in detail. If you have questions about the product, feel free to email Eric and I. We're happy to take those questions, but it's not something we're going to focus on in the Q&A. Last thing before we go to Q&A is, if you are interested in learning more about what we talked about, we'll say, first of all, of course, there's Alistair Coburn's fantastic paper, the best title in all of software literature as far as I'm concerned. Also take a look at our blogs, and then look at our resources page, where we have a bunch of other webcasts on issues related to automation, and also white papers such as the CI maturity model that sort of put the automated deployments out on the extreme end. We have more information there. So with that, I think we're ready for questions, and there's our emails addresses if you'd like to email questions about the product.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Another great presentation from you guys, and thanks to all of you who have been chatting along as we go along. Don't forget, go ahead and continue to use that chat box if you want to ask any other questions of either Eric or Jeff. Well, here's one question for you. Automation doesn't seem realistic for production deployments for mission-critical applications. Do you have any examples of companies doing continuous deployment for their mission-critical apps?
Well, the example we gave of IMView is certainly one that, what they do is kind of a virtual reality environment, and it's sort of like Second Life, where there's a retail aspect related to it, and they make all their money on that software that they host, and they push it out 50 times a day. Now that said, that's not to say that every company is going to want to go to continuous deployment for their particular environment. And for those people, I'd say, take a look at the concept of continuous delivery, which I think is a term coined by Jez Humble and Dave Farley in their book, Continuous Delivery. And what they basically mean is having all the same elements in place and all of it happening automatically up until, but not including production. But in production, you'd still have a manual step to go live. So I think for people who don't want to go that final step, going everything up to, say, user acceptance test, having it be automated, and then once you do that final validation, pushing it live, I think that's a very viable approach.
Cool, great. Someone was just asking in the chat, what was the name of that company? And it's IMVU, that's correct?
That's correct.
All righty. Great. So next question, too. Our operations team tells us that they need to have their own deployment process to pass audit. Have you encountered this before? And if so, what does it mean for automated deployments?
Yes, we've heard that, but it's worth exploring about what it was that they need to have, when they say their own to pass audit. Really, what they need is they need control over the process. So very often the ability to say, we're going to control who has the production passwords. We're going to control who pushes the button to actually do the deployment. And those are the elements that they actually need to have control over. Because we certainly have companies who have put our products into place and pass audit just beautifully. And they pass it because what the auditor wants to know is, do you have your process well defined, and is it well controlled? And if you can show that, then you're going to pass the audit. So I would really push back and try to figure out what is it they think that they need. And I think you're going to find it's really going to be control over the deployment process. And there's nothing about the automation that removes control from them. And again, I would argue actually enhances control quite a bit.
Alrighty. Well, I don't know if you guys addressed this during the presentation, but someone was asking, does automated deployment mean the same as one-click deployment?
Eric, I'll let you take that. I've talked enough.
Yeah. It's close. A one-click deployment is an automated deployment, but there are also the variants like a scheduled deployment, or if I'm doing a nightly deployment to a test environment, or an event-driven deployment of, because there was a build, therefore we're going to go automatically deploy to dev test. So a one-click deployment is certainly a type of automated deployment.
I think the big question comes is it something that's going to work across all environments? Because some people say that, we have one click, but only once we've met certain preconditions. Like either we can do it just to our development environment, or we have to load a bunch of stuff into, manually load stuff into a certain tool. But once it's there, now it's one click to deploy. And that's not really what we mean. We really mean that the developer's going to check in, automated processes will happen, and at that point you're actually ready to do the one click without a lot of manual setup. So that's the one caveat I would have on that.
Cool. And do you guys support a configuration that actually hooks up the easy button from Staples with the product? I'm just kidding. So how will you control the configuration of different environments during an automated deployment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we did touch on it right about as this question came in, but we really do want formal environment definition for every environment that's associated with the project, so that we know what servers we're targeting, what parameters that differ are being adjusted, and then also so that we can tie that audit trail back to say we did this to this environment versus that environment. So I think you really want that formal environment definition wired into the deployment automation. It's the key.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's actually something we have built into our tool, but for a lot of people who don't have that, we might look and see if you have a CMDB that you have read access to that has the right information in it. That might be a place to look where you might have a source available.
Excellent.
Unfortunately, very often we find people are using CMDBs in a write-only fashion. Right? They only put information in, but they never pull it out for use. And this is an actual role that CMDBs could add value at.
Sure. Well, another question came during the presentation. Can the cloning from ops to dev and QA be automated? I mean, to the extent that cloning and testing of the resulting clones is automated.
Yes.
You want to go for this one, Eric?
Yeah, to the degree that I understand it. So I've seen a couple of variants of this. One would be that in the production environments, there are changes to, say, application server configuration, and we know that that's the configuration we want to use in the future, so we need to push that back down to the earlier environments. In that case, how I look at modeling this is just like when we're deploying an application, we're extracting a build out of a build server or something like that to deploy. We're extracting the configuration of the app from production and then using that as a version of the configuration and deploying it through the environments. The other place I see this done a lot is database extracts, and it's a similar idea. We're going to extract the database and then use that same automation to push to the other environments. So we talked earlier about using the automation platform in an extensible way, doing more interesting things than just saying, okay, we're just going to do some basic deployment automation. I would include this in that extending the platform category of, you have an automation framework, go use it for new, interesting, cool things. This sort of cloning makes a lot of sense.
I'll just add just one more thing in here. I think this is really a good point to introduce the concept of DevOps, which is the cooperation between development and operations to ease the delivery of software. And what you're describing here, of taking the clone and dev environment, probably in a virtual machine, but allowing it to be instantiated in dev and test so that you're testing a realistic configuration of what the production environment will be, is probably the most common way we've seen DevOps being applied. And it's useful, but we're actually adding in sort of what I would say is a second step on top of that, which is after you have the runtime environment, now you need to actually automate the deployment of the software into it, not just the infrastructure. So, because very often what comes from ops does not include the software, because that's what's changing, but it's going to be just the runtime environment. So it's making sure you have both of those. And you can actually then go, once you've done that, take those clones that you've deployed the information into and push it up the chain to operations, or run the same process in ops that you've automated down in the test environments. So I want to make that distinction between the application deployment versus the environment cloning, which I think is what is I see people more commonly do.
Alrighty, so I think we've got time for another question or so. So what's the point of testing a previous build now when they should have been tested before? QA can't have a new build if it's not ready regardless, right?
That's a great point. It's something I often talk to people about. So I think the issue comes here is if your current build is broken, what value is there in testing the previous build? And I think there's two answers for that. One is, well, there's not really, in the sense that you're going to have to go and it's not going to be sufficient for final validation. Clearly, you need to validate the final build. However, if your break is in one area, so for example, someone broke the login process, then there's still going to be value for me using yesterday's build when login worked to go test some of the functionality and maybe uncover bugs and defects that existed yesterday that haven't yet been addressed. So from the point of view, and what you think about it is, the defects you find from yesterday's build are probably still valid. However, you cannot consider that you've passed any sort of validation against an old build. So you're still going to need to go back and retest that, but hopefully you're going to uncover those defects sooner to fix them so that when your next build or your tomorrow's build will have those defects fixed. So that's I think the purpose of using old builds.
Alrighty, well, looks like another great hour of presentation from you guys. It's been great to hear from you again.
All right, thanks, Patrick.
Sure, and thanks to everyone who participated out there in the chat, and look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. And any final thoughts from you guys, Eric and Jeff?
Well, I would just reiterate, hopefully people here are charged up to go back and put their current manual deployment process to death and move on to a better future with automation.
Great,
Absolutely.
Sounds good. All right, thanks again, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. And thanks to everyone who helped put this webcast on today. Bye-bye.